Web Marketing That Works podcast, episode 109. With today's guest, he's actually a repeat guest, Trevor Young.
Welcome to the Web Marketing That Works podcast. Come behind the scenes of real-life marketing experiments and listen in as amazing guests confess the truth about what really works. Now, here are your hosts, Adam Franklin and Toby Jenkins.
Welcome to the Web Marketing That Works podcast. I'm Adam Franklin, and this is the show for people who love marketing on the web. You'll be taken behind the scenes of real-life marketing experiments. We'll look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. We confess what's failed and reveal the truth about what really works. The show is brought to you by the book that Toby and I wrote, which is called Web Marketing That Works. And there's a special gift for you, our listener, and that is the bonus 33 marketing templates. You can get your hands on those at bluewiremedia.com.au/book. Now, today's guest is one of our repeat guests. He was back on episode 30 when he chatted to Toby. And today I have got Trevor Young, and we're actually going to talk about, his passion thing. He's a PR warrior. He's got this new concept, not a new concept, but he's using this phrase, Omnipresence, and we're going to dive into that. We're going to look at what's changed since his book came out a couple of years back. His book is called Micro Domination, and it's published by Wiley. I spoke with him when it came out a few years ago, and in the book he follows the journey of people like Gary Vaynerchuk, Chris Guillebeau, Darren Rouse, and it's interesting actually in our discussion because we compare where those people were then to where they've taken their profile and their business now. So that's some of the stuff we're going to chat about on the call today with Trevor. So let's get over to the action and kick this interview off. Trevor Young, welcome to the Web Marketing That Works podcast. How are you?
Adam Franklin, thank you very much. I am very well, thank you.
Excellent. Now, about 75 episodes ago, you came onto the show and had a chat to Toby, and very grateful that I can chew your ear off for this particular show because there's always lots of questions. I always enjoy our chats, and we both went to the Gold Coast recently for the We Are Podcast conference, and it was the first conference in the Southern Hemisphere. It was a fantastic weekend, but there's a few things, just based on social media, PR, reputation, that I just want to dive a bit deeper on with you. So, look, I guess first question is, what's been going on since Micro Domination, your book, came out?
The world's changed probably 3 times since then. I looked back at the book the other day, actually, and started reading it again and going through it after quite a decent break, and it really is, it still stacks up because it's, some of the tools changed, though, because I wrote it when a lot of the tools were still very big and the big ones have got bigger, so nothing's really dropped off the radar since then. But I just think it's becoming a lot more acceptable. I mentioned in the book micro mavens, who you might recall, the likes of Darren Rouse and Chris Brogan and Gary Vaynerchuk and Marie Forleo and Chris Guillebeau and all of those guys. And what they've done is really change as well. So it's interesting to actually see how they've developed and moved on as well and becoming more slicker operations. So as I started writing the book and for a couple of years researching those people and following them, it was still a bit rough and ready and building the community and putting out fantastic content and then building a business around the audience that managed to grow. And now there's some of them, you look at Brian Clark, who I mentioned in the book, and he's got the copy blogger media empire now called Rainmaker Digital, and it just keeps getting bigger. It's a beast. And Darren Rouse is putting on major conferences with 700 or 800 attendees at these pro blogger conferences on the Gold Coast. So the people that I did highlight in the book, they're the ones that have moved on. And so we can continue to learn from them. And I think the basics of the book are still very much alive.
Yeah, absolutely. You see that these guys mature from, I guess, a couple of years ago, which, 2 or 3 short years, in internet years, that so much can change, as you say. and their businesses have really become full scale, 7 or often 8-figure businesses. And it still comes back to, looking at where they started. I mean, you studied them in your book and you looked at where they came from, all of those people. And a lot of it was around building that reputation. And now they're everywhere. Like everywhere you go, there's Gary Vee, there's Brian Clark, there's Darren Rouse. They've got this huge, huge presence on the web. And that's something that I know you spoke about at the conference at We Are Podcast. So can you talk us through this concept of omnipresence?
Yeah, I can. The whole thing about omnipresence, and one thing I do say is omnipresence can mean whatever it wants to you. You mentioned Gary Vaynerchuk, and if in our space, in social media and entrepreneurial circles, he's very omnipresent. You can't open up Twitter or Facebook or whatever, and he's there. He's very much in your face, literally and figuratively. But I do it as you do. I do a lot of talks around the country to a range of business people, senior leaders and corporates, and then entrepreneurs, and just a really vast array of different people. And 9 times out of 10, no one's heard of him. And so, even as big as he's gotten, he's New York Times bestselling author 3 times over, and he started an agency called VaynerMedia and got 500 staff in something like 4 or 5 years, and he's on CNN and NBC and everything else. A lot of people still don't know him, and so omnipresence to me, is within your world. So it might be your community or a geographic location. It might be in a sliver of your niche. It might be your industry or profession. But what it really does mean is that you have a multi-channel approach. People can, it's almost like people within that field or that space that you want to be known in, wherever they go, you seem to be there. And there's this consistency of showing up and adding value across multiple channels. And you can do that strategically. Obviously, it takes a little bit of work, but I think the days of just saying, I'll just be in the industry journal or the local newspaper or something, that's not enough anymore, because our attention spans are diverted into multiple channels, and people are opting into you. So, the goal really is to get people to opt into your content, to follow you, and then hopefully they do see you every now and then and your content resonates. And as you'll attest, Adam, it's great to get them on as a subscriber to your email newsletter, and that way you can continue that conversation. You're going to be a little bit more omnipresent in their life. And I'll just finish on saying that the word presence is really important. Omni, obviously, and multiple channels, but presence. A lot of people can be on social media, you can have a blog, but have no presence. And the presence means that people feel they know you, you're alive, there's vibrancy. And, if you include that across multiple channels, you've got a lot better chance of standing out in what is, as you'll agree, a very, very noisy marketplace, and it ain't going to get any less so anytime soon.
It's a really interesting point there, Trevor, that the Gary V's, the Darren Rouse, the Brian Clark, they're all massive profiles now, they're all massive businesses, but they still have that presence. And I would have exchanged tweets and possibly even emails with all of those people that you've mentioned. Now, they wouldn't know me from a bar of soap. Maybe soon, hopefully they will. But, when I was interacting with them, they still took the time to reply, and they took the time to be present, even if it was for the 20 seconds it took to craft the tweet. But that has such a big impact on somebody like me who goes, well, this guy's got 1 million Twitter followers or $10 million business, and they've taken the time out of their day to tweet me or to reply to my email. You go, wow, that is one cool dude. And you actually have this strong affinity for them because of one tiny little thing that they've done. And that's something that I've tried to take on board too, is that, a well-timed tweet or email can just be so meaningful to other people that people often overlook it. They sort of see it as a bit of a chore or homework, or who wants to, be tweeting and emailing all this time. But the impact that it can have, certainly in my experience being on the receiving end of it, has been huge. And of course, something that I'm trying to emulate now. He also made a couple of good points that you've studied this journey from them building from the ground up and then developing this profile as micro mavens that you talked about in the book to now becoming big, profitable businesses and very, internet famous, at least in their own little sliver of a world. But what advice would you have to people in, say, other industries like the marketing world that we live in, especially the online marketing world that we live in? This is all pretty, we're across all the platforms. We know, you and I did a blab earlier. we're across Periscope and all these things that people in other industries will just be talking German to them. So what would you advise people to do who are looking to follow in the footsteps of the Brian Clarks and Gary V's, but who are in a different industry, who have all this opportunity ahead of them and it's not so noisy in their sector?
And so they know the tools? They're people who are savvy and know the tools?
Not necessarily yet. No, they might need to have a bit of a learning curve.
Gotcha.
But where will they focus their attention and what should they be doing?
Okay, and before I forget, I'm going to ask you a question too. You can mull on it and come back to me after I finish yours. Okay. We're just doing a double interview here. But with the Gary V's and those sorts of guys and they're answering it, do you reckon that they check you out? Just have a think about that because I want to talk about a bit about validation in a tick. So I deal a lot with business professionals and I deal with people who are very savvy in what they do and they're on the tools and they're doing stuff. Is that the sort of person that they're out there, they're understanding what's going on? They're not really just flapping around in the breeze, but it's probably a bit overwhelmed. And what I try and do, and I do strategy work for people and just try and get them to take a couple of steps back and not worry about the tools so much. So I look at owned, earned, I break it down into owned, earned, and social media and how they all work together. And it's just really to get a feel for that because once you understand that and how they work, then everything else kind of falls into place a little bit. And this is about building visibility, influence, trust in your personal brand, your reputation. And I like to use the word recognition for your personal brand or your business brand and what you do and what you stand for. Recognition, is about not just people being aware of you and recognizing your name or your face, but also recognizing you for who it is, who you are and what you do. So recognition is a wonderful word. And that's before you get into all the tips and the tricks and all the other little hacks and the things that you can do. Because you need to build that brand name. And as things get busier and busier, it's going to be the personalities and the brands the personal brands that people will gravitate towards. But I look at owned media is all that content that you can own. So it's your blog or your podcast or, your website, your email list and the newsletter that you send out, the app that you create. So that's your own stuff and your own channels. I think I look at the earned media, and that's probably a bit more in the traditional PR space, which is where I'm from, and that's media relations and influencer relations, where you're earning the right for a journalist to call you up and to get a quote from you or to run a profile on you or for you to run a guest post on someone's blog perhaps or an opinion piece in your industry trade journal. You've earned the right. That's not free publicity. You've earned the right for that to happen. And then there's social media that slots nicely into both of those because social media is, you own the content that you put in, let's face it. You're in charge of the tweets and the Facebook updates. You just don't own the platforms that you put on. And as we know, Facebook can change the rules as they do on a seemingly daily basis. And you can be left all at sea if that is your only platform. So social is owned media in one respect, but it's also the social media world is earned because if I retweet you or if someone says I'm after a good web marketer, who should I go with? And I see that on Twitter and I recommend you. That you've earned the right for me to say that. And so you've still earned that. That just doesn't come free and cheap. You had to, you've had to earn it by, making me aware of you and for me to know, like, and trust you through the content you create and the value you deliver. And so that's where owned, earned and social media come in. I also like to put in events there because sometimes you can create an event or a meetup series. That's owned media from one respect. But on the other side, you might be invited to speak at a conference or an event of some description or a seminar, and you've earned the right for that. So social and events kind of go hand in hand. And it's a matter about looking at those three discrete areas and working out how they join together. But I like to start off with owned first because, that's the stuff you can control. That was pretty long-winded, wasn't it?
No, that's exactly what I wanted to hear. You mentioned also that you have a foot in the corporate land and helping business people with their corporate communication strategies, but you also live in the online world of content publishing and social media and everything else. And I kind of feel I've got a foot in each camp as well, and that I live in this online world like you do, but I also consult and speak and work with more traditional businesses. Now, in the sort of advice that you give to people, are you telling people to do press releases and some of that sort of stuff, or is there an online equivalent? Because I just want to shortly get to the bottom of some of the atrocious outreach emails that you must get every day and that I get most days that just don't seem, they just seem like they're transplanted from the 90s in a digital world. But I kind of want to know, what advice do you have to people who might traditionally have been sending press releases? Like, what's the new way of doing it or the effective way of doing it?
So let's just put that aside to media, although I suppose media today is bloggers and podcasts. So let's just say media and influencer relations and pull them together. I'm coming back to media relations. I got so far away from it after doing it for 20 years that I got so far away from it, I was happy to. And it's not a good use of my time to be doing that, because there are some people that's all they do, and they should be doing it more than me, because, if there's a journo I know and I've got a client or someone and I can put in a call, I'll make that happen. But I actually don't do that, but I prep people for doing it, or I bring in a media relations specialist to help me execute on that if and when a client is ready and right for that. But there's still room for the press release when there's news and when it could work across, talkback radio and TV and mainstream press. That's when a press release can work. David Meerman Scott, who we're both familiar with, and he's the author of the New Rules of Marketing and PR, he talks about putting up an online press release just for being visible and being found through search engines. So there's that side of things. But the days of just, unless you're a big multinational company and delivering some results, for quarterly results or something like that, that's when you just pivot out to the business press. But for the rest of us mere mortals, the whole notion of just pinging out a press release, and that's spray and pray, and it really doesn't work in most cases. Usually they're badly written for starters, and they're not targeted, and so they're irrelevant. And we've got, less journalists with less time, and so they write the stuff that comes to them through people they've got relationships with, maybe their PR agencies, or they're people who they've quoted in the past, they've built a relationship with them, and so when they need a quote in a hurry, they go back to the source that gave them a really good quote last time. And so I see this quite a few times. I had one online business publication call me. I've been interviewed a number of times, given them quotes. Then they started calling me about some things that were a little out of my sphere, and I wasn't really interested. And so I've handed them off to some experts. And one particular expert is a friend of mine she's since got probably, I reckon, about 8 or 9 stories and quotes within that. So that goes to show that, if they find someone who gives them good quote, then they'll stick with them, and then it's harder to break into that from someone on the outside. But, to get to media, it's relationships first wherever possible, but that's not always possible. And sometimes if you're doing it yourself, well, yes, it's a longer term game. Make relationships in advance. Add value, know the audience of the journalist and what they're doing, or if it's a podcast you want to be on, know that audience before you pitch. Build up a relationship with the podcaster, the blogger, the journalist, wherever possible. Otherwise, just make it a really compelling story, and you've got to know that journalist's newspaper, magazine, or their audience as well as they know themselves. Seriously, you do, and that's hard yards.
That does sound hard yards, and it sounds like the effort, it's worth putting in to get those sorts of relationships and publicity pieces. But it's astounding how many emails even I get, and I'm not a mainstream media person by any stretch, but companies that will literally write a press release and send it to me talking about somebody being appointed within the company. Like whenever somebody gets a job, they send a press release, or whenever a company wins a new client, it's as if they think that's news. I've never seen that type of stuff reported, unless it's the new Prime Minister or the cricket captain, somebody getting a new job. I never see covered in the newspaper or the TV or whatnot. And yet it seems like all these press releases that are sent by professional PR people and coming to me for some reason, and I don't know who they are, like people seem to be paying money for this. And so, I'm going on a bit of a rant here, but I don't know whether
let's tee off on that then.
Yeah, because it's annoying getting them, and I often mark them as spam. But they're legit companies. Like they put their mobile number, they're Australian very often, and so they're either paying lots of money to an agency who's going, okay, yeah, we'll send it out for you, and taking all their money when there's not going to get many results. I wouldn't have thought, or they aren't giving the good advice, which is go and actually form relationships and do some research on who you're actually going to send the thing to, because every day they come in and they're atrocious. And I just thought I'd have a bit of a rant with you and see what your take on it is, since you're the PR warrior.
Mate, I hear you. I hear you. I feel for you. I understand it. I get them myself, and I've always made sure that I've never been the one to send them. But there are some in our industry, and that's just lazy. Now, on there, sometimes you get PR people who are maybe younger, who are thrown into the deep end by their older bosses. This is agencies. Or maybe someone who works in-house, but, they're too afraid to stand up to their client and to say, no, we're not going to put that out. And they end up, the client just overwhelms them, and you've got to put this out, you've got to send it because it's news. And every brand, every CEO, every company, business owner thinks that what they do is of interest. And as we know, no one gives a toss, particularly the media. Now, if you go back 20 years, the newspapers actually did have and even BRW, I think, Business Review Weekly magazine, they did have little sections for new appointments, but you had to be a reasonable level of executive to crack that. The trade publications, so if I look at the advertising and marketing industry, the trade publications do talk about moves, but it's not just a small move. It has to be a CEO crossing to a competitor. Wherever there's a bit of drama, that's when those appointments come in, because usually there's a bit of drama around it. So that makes a better story, of course. So in some trade journals, that works. Sending it to you, I'm sorry, mate, but you are not the new appointment. Maybe there's a blog there, the new appointments blog. And anyone in business can just send stuff to you. And unfortunately, you'll have a very minute audience, except for the people who sent it to you. So it's not right. It's lazy. You've wound up on some list that a media directory of sorts. That's fact, because I doubt it they've taken the time to find you, because that takes hard yards to do your research, to find individual bloggers and all of that. And they've just got a list and they're pinging it out to people. Or maybe you're on a list of marketing bloggers or something. But, and to be fair to the PR people too, they're not given the budgets and therefore the time to invest in the research that is required to target it. So the fault is not just the PR people. The fault might be, because often they're quite young and intimidated a little bit, but it will be the client. Now, I know when I ran an agency and if a client wanted me to put out crap, I was quite happy to say, that's fine, but I put your name on the bottom because I've got to talk with these journalists all the time. I'll send it out. Your name will be all over it. Mine will be nowhere near it, and I won't follow it up. And that changes the tenor of the conversation really quickly.
Gotcha. See, it's interesting because, PR people normally are lovely. And if you do, getting outreach emails are so flattering, especially when people have actually worked out your first name, which is, maybe 1 in 10. Having people interested enough to want to share information with you is a wonderful privilege. And, more often than not, if it's relevant, I'll certainly give people the time of day and get them on the podcast or link to them or share their material via Twitter. But I've always just kind of wanted the inside word on what your take on it was, because it does just seem like a tremendous waste of time, and with a bit of guidance could be done so much better. Because as you say, once you've got the relationship and that reputation and recognition that you speak of, which is so true, all that effort into spamming a marketing blog about some events director in Melbourne, that time and money had been spent reading an article and connecting and what have you, could just be lead to so many more results.
Well, that's the thing, and the clients want results. And let me be fair to a lot of PR people. There are some that are just brilliant, and they will push back and they'll craft it. And I've worked with a lot of them, and they're working with one now. They'll craft it and they'll develop it until we get, I'm just working on a client now. I'm going back into that bit of that media. I've written a media release for the very first time in a long time. And it took me about 10 goes to get it right. I just spent so much time on it, just getting it right. It's like starting with a hunk of clay and getting it down into a good-looking statue at the end. You've got to put that effort in, and you've got to work out what the news, and if the news isn't there, don't send it. Come up with something else. Have a point of view. So now, we're talking about what you can do. So in days gone by, and this is still relevant, you still need to pitch if you want to be proactive about it. And, whether it's through sending out a press release, which, only in the right circumstances, that's right. Usually it's better to target someone who hits your audience, that you've built a relationship and you've got an affinity for and you like what it is that they do. And then you craft something that you hope will really hit the spot straight away for them. That's number one. That's pushing out. But today we can pull the media to us.
Oh, yes, let's talk about that.
Through our owned media, because there's a couple of reasons why that works. Number one, if they're covering a particular beat and you're an omnipresence in that beat, they'll check you out. They'll find you. They have to if they're doing their job, or if you're doing your job as the professional trying to raise their profile. They'll find you, and if you haven't already found them and linked in with them or been on Twitter. So they'll notice you, or they'll ask. A lot of times they'll ask. They'll put it out to Twitter and say, is anyone an expert in, IP law or something like that? And hopefully if they're engaged and they've got a good community around them, that someone will say, I'll speak to such and such. And so people will find you, people will advocate on your behalf. And that's really important. And that comes down to the content and social that you create. So what we've found is that today, that's where the owned media strategy is really good, because you can pull people to you. You can pull the media to you and attract them to you, and they'll find you and they'll find out, I mentioned the word earlier towards you, and I want you to come back with that answer about validation. So once they've found you through however they've found you, whether it's through recommendation or they've seen you on Twitter or they've actually read a blog post or something like that, they'll go and check you out in more detail before the journalist will take it to the next step. Same as if you were going to do a podcast with someone, you'll check them out. Or if you're going to interview someone for a blog, you'll check them out. And so what you find, if you're the person, what will a journalist find if they check you out? Is their validation, will they be validated in their own mind that you're an expert in your space and authority, and that they won't look silly? Because the journalist doesn't want to look silly if they start quoting you and you actually don't know what you're talking about. And so that whole notion of owned media from a validation perspective is number one. Number two is have that omnipresence through social and content, etc., that if journalists can find you that way. And I know, Adam, you've been interviewed before. I'm tipping you don't necessarily go out and pitch yourself. Since I've been blogging, I've been in, 50 articles. I'm doing a podcast interview very regularly, that side of things. It comes to you as a result, but that's the graft. You've got to earn the right for that to happen. And I guess the other one other part is that guest posting is where there's a lot of action at the moment, because there are a lot of blogs and what I call hybrid media, which is an online-only publication, which is more than a hobby. It's a business, but it's also just a digital-only business as well. And so at the very top, you'd say a Huffington Post fits in that, and Business Insider and Lifehacker. And going down the tree a little bit, you'll get the smaller ones like the more industry ones. So in our industry in marketing and advertising, there's Mumbrella, for example. And a lot of these, even the bigger guys, they run on a bit of a smell of an oily rag. They've still got virtual paper to fill ongoing, and they want good content from really good people. And so, that's when you've got an opportunity to write an article under your own name and to build a relationship from that article and keep writing. I guest post for a recruitment agency in the creative digital PR and media space called Firebrand Talent. And they've got about 35,000 audience. They got, double that on Twitter and Facebook. And so they've got a really nice platform. And I'm happy to write for them every couple of months because they promote me on their platform out to a really engaged audience that's an audience I need to reach. Only yesterday I got someone DMing me asking me inviting me to write a post for their blog. And like yourself, you probably get these a little bit, but I always check them out. And this one's got over 1 million readers. So that's, for me, potentially that's bigger than being in the newspaper. And so these are the things that happen. So that's the incoming. So there's pitching out and doing that strategically, but there's also attracting people in and attracting journalists and bloggers and podcasters to you. So it doesn't happen by happenstance, if that's the word. It doesn't just happen. You've got to put a bit of thought and a bit of elbow grease into it.
Okay, so just to recap, you can do your pitching out, you can do your outreach, and I would imagine using basic things like a Google search and maybe a LinkedIn advanced search, you can identify who the players are in your industry, the editors of the appropriate publications, and maybe pitch them by sending them an email, or better yet, forming a relationship with them over social media and the like. And that's your outbound type of stuff. And then you've got your inbound, which is publishing the content, whether it's on your own blog or on a guest blog, like you've mentioned, and then attracting those types of opportunities in.
Yep, that's right. Just in terms of the pitching out to media, rather than do it on a LinkedIn, that might be one way, but really If they're sort of an editor or a journalist, you'll find out who they are because you should be reading what they write.
Good point.
You should be tracking them down. Now, some newspapers, the bigger ones, make it difficult for you to find them, but there's usually ways around that. But yeah, you should really know the news. You have to read. You have to know their audience really, really well to know whether something resonates. And then if LinkedIn is one way of finding them, that's fantastic. But it wouldn't be your first port of call.
Okay, interesting. All right, now let's swing around to your question that you had for me earlier. Let's dive into that.
Yeah, well, it was when you're saying that you speak to some of these big guns in their various online worlds, and you gave a few of the names, and they're actually, they're present in the conversation, and they'll sometimes come back to you, which is really good. And I was just musing, really, do you think that they've checked you out at all? Do they check you out before they talk to you? And I just find that interesting because I know that, a journalist would, and I'm not saying that these guys do, but I'm just going through this phase at the moment that I think validation is really important, and it's not talked about too much in terms of, it's all about getting found through keywords, driving traffic and squeezing people through your funnel and all of that sort of beautiful jargon. But ultimately, I think that, it's validation. Do people check you out, and what do they find? And is what they find congruent to what they feel about you through your online activities generally and what you're saying on Twitter? If they go to you might be really out loud and proud on Twitter, and they go to your website and you've got no rants or no value there. So what does that say? So it's this consistency of through all your channels of your output, whether it's writing, speaking, whether it's on stage, whether it's tweeting, whatever it is. And that's personal branding, isn't it? People's collective experiences of having come in contact with you, whether it's on the phone, in person, via Twitter, LinkedIn, where they read your blog, watch your videos, listen to your podcast. You have to be consistent.
Yeah, you definitely do. And certainly on the receiving end of those interactions, the people that I mentioned, like the Seth Godins and Gary Vaynerchuk's and Brian Clark's, they've been incredibly consistent with how I perceive them through their content, whether it's videos or presentations or blog posts. They certainly have been. As for whether they look at me and before they tweet me back, I doubt it, because the volume of tweets they send. Well, Gary Vee, for example, sends so many tweets. On his way to the airport after a keynote presentation, he'd have hundreds of people to reply back to. So I wouldn't imagine he would be looking at my profile before he tweets. But that said,
maybe your name's popped up before because you've done a few things.
Yeah, but maybe that's just one of the things. If he then sees me on his blog and then doing an Ask Gary Vee question and then turn up at an event and go and say hello, then that's a whole bunch of different touch points. And I think eventually you can get on people's radar. Eventually for some of those bigger people. But I think most people would. I mean, I certainly make the effort to look at people. If people tweet me, I'll look at their Twitter and I'll see which country they're in, or I'll see what type of work they're in. And if I've got time, and I can't always do it, of course, and these people have way more followers than I do, but I love just having the time, that luxury of time, to actually be able to ask them how things are going in their business, or what role they're in, or what project they're working on. And, because just showing that interest, a lot of people say, oh, well, thanks for asking. And then they get this permission to talk about themselves and talk about what's on their mind or in their city or, the project they're working on. And just those little interactions done on a regular basis builds momentum over time. And, I'm sure that, that's what Gary Vee said in a ton of his videos. He spends his whole time interacting with people and he still manages to do it on scale. So I'm incredibly impressed by how he does it. And, you just try and pick up the bits that have worked well on you and try and implement them with your own online digital footprint.
There's also a lesson there is that everyone wants to go for the big hit all the time. And it just, unless you're known, you've got to build up to that. So rather than try and attack the A-listers all the time, have a crack by all means. But, sometimes a better strategy is to start building a bit of grassroots credibility on the C and the B list. And you build up from there, and then, you can say you've been here, or you've got that social proof, which I think is very important. And again, you want to be validated in the eyes of the A-listers, whoever the A-listers are, whether they're journalists of a radio station or a newspaper or your industry trade journal, whatever, A-list means to you. But that's a key. And I recall, working with a global PR firm and speaking to one of the guys, and in Chicago they were based, and they said they had this fantastic story of a startup, and a good PR person knows a really good story. Sometimes sometimes they know it better than the journalist and they freak out because they can't sell it into the journalist. And you absolutely know crystal clear that story is a good one and right for that publication, but you can't tell a journo that he's wrong, or she. But they were saying how this story was super duper and it was befitting of an A-list tech blog or a magazine in the States. And they just could not get it across the line. So they started small. They went back to grassroots, plan B, started small, building up with the smaller bloggers, still influential, but not the massive audiences, and built up. And next thing, after a couple of months, the main guys came calling.
Yeah, it's an interesting point.
It's a great story.
Yeah, because you listen to some, I study Gary Vee quite a lot, and as I do with Seth Godin, but he did hundreds, maybe 900 or 1,000 daily YouTube videos, and before he started his Vayner Media, and then he's done hundreds or thousands and thousands of tweets interacting with people, and done hundreds and hundreds of podcasts, and people just see the big hits of him on TV or getting these New York Times best-selling books, but people tend to overlook the years and years and years of hustle and hard work and interacting and caring about people and being genuine and adding value. And certainly, they're the names that have come up just as examples of, the more high-profile names, but certainly the most of my attention is on my peer network and people in my community and all those people that you can go on the journey with. And, I think like a lot of the relationships that Gary's spoken about too are people that he's known for years, and he knew these people before they were big editors, and they knew him before he was, Gary Vaynerchuk, and it's these long-term relationships and this reputation and recognition that you speak about that, you don't see under the surface. People only often see the surface and don't actually realize what's gone into it, which is all the little stuff.
Yeah, the 10 or 15-year success story. And I recall him saying in one of his very many interviews that, when he was doing the YouTube early days and no audience or anything, but he was active in the wine space because it was Wine Library TV, and he was doing only stuff on wine at that point because he was running a liquor store with his dad. But he'd go on to all the wine blogs and he'd add comments and he was just active. So there's that side, one-to-one micro interaction with the community. There's the being relentless and putting that content out again and again and again and again and again and again. Brian Solis says it's about being relentless, and I've co-opted that term. And then the third one is giving interviews, and he talks about this all the time as well. Giving interviews to someone who might have, 50 listeners or, hardly any followers or whatever it is, but giving them the time of day and taking the interview. Now, obviously, the bigger you get, the harder that is to scale, of course. But even then, I've heard a lot of those guys on, podcasts that I wouldn't term the big guys. And so they've still, had the humility to do that. And I like that. I really do. I don't like it if someone gets too big and they don't do that. You probably can't do everyone, but it's the intent, I think, that makes a difference. So they're the three things, the relentless interaction with people generally through social channels, going to events, making yourself open and accessible to people. The second one is that relentlessness in terms of creating the content. And the third one really is that, again, being open to being interviewed by all sorts of different micro media players, if I can call them that, as a way of building up to the bigger guys. And while you're doing that, you're starting to hone your message. You're starting to find your voice. No one can just walk into an interview and be great at it. It takes time. It takes time. Same as speaking. As you know, public speaking. You don't just start and be a good speaker. You have to hone it over, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 presentations.
Absolutely. Now, that's some great tips there, Trevor, and probably a good way to end the interview on those 3 points. So, look, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's always a load of fun chatting. Where can people find out more about you, Trevor?
My website is prwarrior.com and a lot of stuff on that. And on Twitter, I am at Trevor Young.
And what podcast should listeners be tuning into to hear you?
Reputation Revolution, the DIY personal branding podcast for business professionals.
There we go. Very good. Thank you. Well, that's where you can find more about Trevor. Thank you, mate. And we'll see you all on the next show. Cheers.
Cheers, Adam. Thank you.
And that's a wrap for my chat with Trevor Young, aka the PR Warrior. Very interesting to get to the bottom of some of these press releases. I know I may have gone on a bit of a rant, but I'm just so interested why people send them, what the theory is behind them, and whether they actually do get results. And maybe I'm just not, the wrong target market for some of them. But of course, you don't learn stuff if you don't try stuff, so maybe that's the reason behind it too. Trevor was very big on reputation and recognition, which are two words that I really quite like, a lot more so than, say, personal brand. I often struggle with the word brand because it's got so many different meanings to different people, a lot of baggage, and it's hard to know specifically what people mean by it, or at least I struggle to find out what people mean by it. But reputation and recognition, I can see why Trevor is so big on those words. So I hope you found today's podcast actionable and useful. It would be very much appreciated if you did find it useful, if you could leave us a review on iTunes. It certainly helps our visibility. And if you want to drop me a line, I'm on adam.franklin@bluewiremedia.com.au. And of course, tweet me at Franklin_Adam. And finally, if you do want to get your hands on the marketing templates from our book, please head to bluewiremedia.com.au/book. Now that's a wrap, and I'll see you next time.